So, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Devanshi and I will be your MC for this session. Good evening and welcome to the WebEx session COVID-19 Impact on Tech Industry, Contract Performance, People and Security. The session will be presented by my colleagues Gowree, Gokhale, Vaibhav, Parikh and Ajay, Solanki. Please note that this session will be in listen-only mode and will last for about 60 minutes, of which the first 30 to 40 minutes will be spent on panel discussion. The remaining time will be available for question and answers. We request all our participants to post their questions in the chat window. The moderator will queue up the questions for the speakers accordingly. I request you to keep writing the questions while the panel discussion is on. Should you need any assistance during the conference call, please use the chat option. You may also note that this conference is being recorded. I now welcome our session presenter, Gowree Gokhale, co-head and leader of our TMT practice, and the other panelists are Vaibhav Parikh, co-head TMT practice, and also heads our firm's US operations and is based out of New York. Ajay Singh Solanki is leader of the firm's HR law practice. Lastly, I would like to request all the participants in this session to please put your phones on silent mode as it creates a certain disturbance while the speakers are talking. Thank you so much. Over to you, Gowree. You may please.
Thank you, Devanshi, and trust all of you on the call are safe and taking enough care in this situation that the entire world is facing. Unfortunately, we are in this situation. However, it teaches us new ways to look at life, new ways to look at our relationships, and new ways to look at business models. Within no time since we started, the world started facing this issue, several of our clients have reached out to us to figure out what are the ways in which we can address the situation, creating new business models, creating quick, products, addressing some of the very interesting data privacy issues because of obviously the data that will be collected, which is health-related data, employment-related issues. So what we have tried to do in this entire week, we are trying to address each of these separately. Today, what we will try to focus is on the tech industry as a whole, to begin with, but specifically focusing on the force majeure clause at the end of the session because that is something which will be definitely invoked in several IT contracts. So we are dividing this session into three parts. The first part we will look at mainly the overall impact on the IT industry, the tech industry as a whole. Second, we will briefly touch upon some of the employee-related aspects because we do have a very extensive session this Thursday at, as you can see on our calendar. And lastly, we will discuss about the, about the force majeure clause as I mentioned. So Vaibhav, over to you because you have been focusing on the IT industry or tech industry overall for last about 25 to 27 years, and you have seen several several loops in which we have seen the industry grow. We also saw a 2K situation exactly 20 years back, and what the IT industry had to go through then. So how do you see now, how do you see the overall impact on the tech industry and then specifically coming to the services sector?
So thank you, friends. Thank you, Gowree. I think tech industry is a very large industry and different aspect of tech industry will have different implications. I think today, let us focus on software services industry or IT industry, what we call it, since that's a larger chunk of Indian tech industry. There has been a lot of thinking going on in the IT industry. First is that depending on how long the lockdown remains, the impact on industry will be determined. They feel that the revenue will be implicated from 0 to 10%, depending on the duration of the slowdown or duration of the lockdown of this crisis remains. So because their clients will get affected, they will definitely get affected. But they also see a kind of a silver lining in the dark cloud. They feel that this is a situation where they can get people working from home, and if this is accepted by their clients and becomes a norm in the industry, then post-COVID-19 era, this can be very useful to them as this can get into that can save costs for them, and as well as kind of create more offshore segment compared to onshore segment. So they are very excited, and I think they are focused. They're excited about this aspect. Overall, they also believe that their industry will get affected and the kind of revenue will decrease. But on a long term, they feel that this will kind of push their industry into working remotely, which will be actually good for their own benefit. Now, having said it, they have to do a lot of thinking right now on a lot of questions which they have not thought about it before. They are facing situations which they have not faced before. So it is also a test of the management agility and ability of the team to respond to some of unprecedented situations. And just giving a few examples. First, in the lockdown, and I am sitting in New York and oversee U.S. markets. I talk to people in California, New York, and other markets. And because of the lockdown, nobody can actually travel anywhere. Nobody can go anywhere, and everybody has to work remotely. The only exception is essential services. Now, the question really is that essential services are limited to specific sectors, right? And essential services also need help from software industry. So they will need, from software industry perspective, the question really will be that, hey, can they be called an essential services? Can their people travel if they are servicing customers which are part of essential services, right? So those kind of questions will need to be addressed by the IT industry management. Also, what will happen is that there will be several situations where there will be pressure on them to deliver. If they are helping hospital is overburdened. I don't think at that point of time software industry may have appropriate people put in available to help this hospital industry. On the other hand, they may have set of people who may be available where there is a slowdown. Example, let's say entertainment industry or tourism industry, right? Now, when there's a slowdown, can they move people from one industry to other industry and give the support to the critical industry? And what happens to the contractual situation where there is a contract where they have promised to deliver certain people, but now they may not be in a position to deliver those set of people, or they may have ability to transfer people from one sector to another sector. So you need to look from contractual perspective. You need to look at what are the points which they may talk to customers and have contracts amended to be able to deliver in this particular area. Also, because of this situation, a lot of people are working from home, and at many places, the contracts do not permit them to work from home. A lot of contracts require on-site working. So clients may have to, the companies may have to go and change the software contract, get permission from clients to get people work from home. They need to set up adequate systems to get people work from home. And because of this reason, there are several implications which can happen from, employment law perspective, from immigration perspective, because immigration rules require certain on-site working, and working from home may or may not be covered. So that's something you need to look at it from tax perspective. So there are various implications which come from working from home concept, so that's a thought process which one will need to look at it, and the new business model will need to be kind of looked into. I think because of post-COVID area, you will see a lot of focus on digital marketing. You will see a lot of focus on SaaS. You will see a lot of focus on remote management, much more than what you see today. So there will be kind of a peak there, and that's something which people will need to provide for. Gowree, over to you. I hope this is something which...
So I think that there is two sort of takeaways, from what we discussed. One is the short term, as to how do you realign your contractual clauses. For example, there will be a certain process laid down in the contract. For example, change request and all, which is very standard in the IT contracts. And whether, in these type of situations when people have to act fast, whether companies are, mindful of following the contractual path that is identified to address the situations, because often, in these type of situations, if things are not documented appropriately at a later point in time, if at all there are disputes, that could come in the way in terms of how the contract was sort of restated, right? The other takeaway is more on the long term, is how should the industry think in terms of whether new business models or whether new ways of delivering goods and services, etc. Right? So I'm sure the strategic thinkers are already sort of using their whiteboards to think about it. But since you mentioned on the employment part, and we have seen a sudden surge of several types of queries coming our way on the employment side. So I'm going to request Ajay to sort of just walk us through. And as I said, we do have a detailed session later on in the week. But this is just a precursor for us to understand what your team has been facing, what sort of issues you have come across in the last couple of weeks. Over to you.
Sure. Sure. Thank you, Gowree. Let me start off by thanking all of you who've joined us from various parts of the world. I know it's testing times for everyone, but I think like all other testing times, I think everybody will wait through this time as well, and this too shall pass, I believe. So with that hopeful statement, I start off by saying that as employers, I think it's your primary duty to maintain the safety and security of your employees. At the same time, all of us, I can completely empathize with the people joining on the call, that all of us have to strike a very fine balance between maintaining the safety and security along with maintaining the business continuity as well. And that's the exact crux of the entire number of questions that we've been receiving in the past, I would say, a week or so. Let me say this, that all the ministries of the department have been working at the speed of thought, I would say. Even as we speak, we are still receiving several of these advisories, notifications, orders from each of the state governments. Especially the Ministry of Health and Family Affairs. Also, we've been receiving several of these notifications and advisories from the district administrations of each of the districts, and the state government itself is grappling with how to handle the entire situation, and therefore we are seeing several of these orders also coming in. So let me quickly say how we started off as in a week back, and then what's the situation right now. I'll quickly summarize that because, as Gowree said, we have a more elaborate session on employment issues on Thursday at the same time. So I hope all of you would be joining us for that as well. So to quickly summarize, we started off, I think, sometime late last week in terms of receiving most of the travel advisories and advisories from the government in terms of what should you be doing with people coming in, going out, quarantine related issues, and all of those aspects. So at that stage, we were just receiving questions in terms of how to handle these employees who are coming in from various parts of the world, including high risk areas, uh, including queries on how do you handle people who are being quarantined, whether they are self quarantining themselves or whether we as employers are forcing them to quarantine, and how do you handle the leave related aspects with respect to these employees. As all of us know, in India you have labor laws at the central level as well as the state level. So obviously I can completely empathize with all of you guys that you guys might be grappling with all of these state laws along with most of these notifications that are generally coming through this particular archaic act of 1897, which is the Epidemic Diseases Act. So at that stage, we were just receiving advisories, including the work from home advisory. And here, NASSCOM did a great job in terms of helping out the tech industry and the ITS industry in terms of coming out with work from home advisory as such. Our firm was fortunate enough to work with them in terms of coming up with the same. So I think that was quite helpful for most of the industry participants. What we are seeing now is a shift from advisory based aspects to more hardcore orders. So what we've been seeing in the past 2 days or 3 days is lockdown orders, as you might have been hearing as such from either they are coming from the health ministry or the health department, or they are coming from each of the local district administrations. These lockdown orders are clearly stating that commercial establishments, which under which the tech industry mostly falls and the IT ES industry falls, most of the establishments need to remain closed. A silver lining there for our industry is that we've been categorized under most of the lockdown orders as essential services in some form or the other. In some forms, they are saying that ITS, which is supporting essential services. In some other states and district administrations have actually given a broader aspect of ITS or e-commerce delivery companies or tech-based companies covered within the essential services. So I think in a gist, this is what is the core of what the government has come out with and the queries that we've been receiving mostly on that front.
Sure, Ajay. So, thanks for that. And I think we also earlier had discussed about unfortunate situations where some of the employers may not be able to continue a certain workforce. There may be queries about, reduction of salary,
Absolutely.
retrenchment, etc., which I believe we will be dealing with on Thursday. But I think
Absolutely.
one takeaway what you said just now is if at all any service feels that they are supporting an essential service, right? That is something there is a possible carve out, and plus, in addition to that, there may be certain, of course, checks and balances around that. But if at all there are any issues, the companies can approach, say, a NASSCOM or some of the relevant ministries and get that clarification. Is that correct?
Absolutely. So just to add here, what we've been seeing in most of the lockdown orders is that there is that one single line always written in the lockdown order saying that if there is any doubt with respect to what constitutes essential services, you can always approach the district administration to seek a clarification on that. So I think that's one good thing. Practically speaking, how would it pan out is something again we'll need to see, because there will be hundreds of companies approaching the district administration, and I think possibly their primary goal right now is to contain the virus as such. So I think how early these applications would be taken through is something that we'll still need to see.
Yeah, I guess all of us will have to sort of figure it out because the government offices also are working at a 5% or a reduced workforce. So yes,
Absolutely.
we'll have to keep that in mind as well. But since you mentioned about both of you mentioned about working from home, etc. In that context, and thanks Ajay, for all that sort of giving an overall perspective. But I'm going to go to Vaibhav now to look at more from an IT company's perspective. You briefly mentioned about how they already are ready from work from home, etc. But how about security issues? Because when you are working from home, there is a lot of remote bandwidth being utilized, exposing it to hacking, etc. Right? So, are we ready? Is the industry ready? What are the quick, steps, if any? Also, please throw some light on, how do you think the insurance aspects will work to manage any cyber incidents? Maybe some thoughts on these points, Vaibhav?
Thanks, Gowree. So first, amongst all different industries, this industry possibly is more prepared for remote working, primarily because of flexible hours and working from home concept, which used to be there even otherwise in this industry, kind of makes it a lot more prepared. Now, having said, there are some issues still this company is currently facing. So, for example, when I was chatting with someone, they were saying that, look, my employees are working from home, but they are working on their personal laptops and desktops, right? And my contact with client does not allow them to work on any desktop or laptop which is not office home. So they are going and taking permission from clients on one side. On the other side, they are actually leasing the laptops of the employees so that it becomes an employer's laptop, and they are not violating the contract. And more importantly, because then it becomes employer's laptop, they can actually put in all the restrictions and security that they need to put in for protection of them and their clients. So these are the kind of things which companies are doing. What we are seeing is that also companies are giving some workers kind of a workstation from their offices to be taken back home. So the security actually goes with that. And also specifically where certain key softwares are required, right? Where they are not working on a thin client, they require access to a certain software which is not possible or not available at home. In that situation, they are arranging this particular servers to be delivered to the employee's home and have access to, or have access to those servers from employees' home. Now, these are all the physical activity which they are doing in order to kind of comply with the remote working concept. The most software companies, because they were actually provided for remote working, already had a lot of security systems in place on the devices which the employees took home. So this is coming in handy for now. Having said it, there are still situations where some of the laptops may require to come back for upgrades, may require to come for audit, may require to be, if there are problems or hackings or the laptop is compromised, it may require to go and taken back and get replaced. Now, all those kind of issues, the company will need to identify on how to handle it. Also, earlier, since there were certain portion of employees who were actually working from home, or they were working for a small part of time compared to all the time, it was easier to manage security and keep tab on it. However, now with 100% of people going to work 100% of time from home, at least in near future, this risk increases drastically, and it will be a big challenge for IT industry to kind of look at it and try to manage it, especially if there is an hacking attempt. How do you address it? Because now you are a lot more exposed to that particular aspect, and then especially since it has client data, how do you go and manage the client on that aspect, right? If you have not invested, can you invest now and implement now? So those questions will become relevant. And if tomorrow that system is hacked, then the question remains is on the liability side, were they not prepared, and is it something which they should have foreseen that people will work from home, and they should have put some processes in place where people working from home would have adequate security protection. So those kind of questions will also come into picture, which we will need to answer. Now, coming to your insurance point, Gowree, I think insurance companies also are going through unprecedented phase in that sense that this is not something which they would have also envisaged. I think they will all go back and look at the exclusion clause and say, hey, is this something which is excluded? How is it going to affect us in insurance companies? Will this bring a lot of liability because certain things are not met with, and there are insurance with software companies can try to trigger, or this is something which they can look at as an opportunity by coming out with new products or coming up with higher premium, trying to cover this kind of thing. So from insurance company perspective, also a lot of things will go back to the drawing board. And from software industry perspective, if at all there is a loss in which there is an insurance, they will need to look carefully on the document to say, hey, whether this particular activity or event was covered or not.
Thanks, Vaibhav. So I think since you mentioned, about the hacking, several times we do get queries about reporting, right? So I think companies will have to be ready because most of these will have, sort of their operation across various jurisdictions, right? So maybe a good idea for companies to also prepare if they don't already have is what is the reporting law insofar as cyber incidents are concerned in different jurisdictions where they operate, and if at all such situations arise, then sort of deal with that according to the law of the relevant jurisdiction. And the point that you mentioned about the liability, in terms of whether covered by insurance or not, may be a good idea to even start looking at the insurance policies, just so that you are able to prepare for the for the future in terms of if you are not covered, how do you sort of revisit your balance sheets, etc., to make provisions, right? So I think that is the other thing probably the companies will have to start thinking
In
about.
fact, just to add to what Gowree you mentioned, these companies are now looking, and I kind of alluded to earlier, so these companies are now looking this as an opportunity also on post-COVID areas, right? Because if they can get this thing right, if they can get the security right, if they can manage the clients, in terms of mindset that it's okay for working from home, right? And it actually works. If they can give that comfort where they don't need to send on-site people, then software industry tends to benefit because more activities can be offshore. And from offshoring perspective is always cost effective for software industry. Plus, when I was chatting with few people, they said that if they are able to have more people working from home, that will reduce their capital cost, their employees' productivity, and overall they can cut down the cost. So this is also a cost-benefit analysis. From that perspective, if they can manage some of these points which come with working from home, they will see a lot of opportunity in this particular thing, even post-COVID area. With this, Gowree, can we go to force major point? And can I ask you a question? How do you see force major working out, especially from a software company perspective?
Right. Since last yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Gowree.
Perfect. So last couple of days, I have been thinking about and probably just revisiting all the contracts over last, about 17, 18 years. And what are the various aspects that you would have taken into account? And just a small, funny thing from my side is, often people say, miscellaneous clauses, are, not typically looked into, at the time of review of the contracts. And somehow my mind always worked the other way around, and I always looked at the miscellaneous clauses first, because it will have an interpretational issue. And whenever I took training session, I always told people to start with the miscellaneous clauses and then come back to the main contract. So it's very interesting that whatever I thought about back then really is working now, because this is one of the most important clauses that has come into play. Now, we can't really look at force majeure clause in isolation in my mind when it comes to IT contracts. And before I delve into this further, and I'm going to take a bit of time because this is one of the key areas that the IT industry will face. But couple of sort of points that I want to make before I start.
I'm not going to get into too much details about the interpretation of the force majeure. We did have a detailed session earlier today, and the participants who want to understand the key provisions of the law, Indian law basically, and some comparative law, we do that. We have that session available on our our app. But I will deal with a couple of quick points now. One important thing will be the governing law of the contract, right? Because as we saw in the earlier session, Indian law may have a certain working of the force majeure interpretation. We did do a comparative law with UK, Delaware, New York, etc. So each jurisdiction will have a different, sort of play for the force majeure clause, interplay, I would say, with the governing law. So that is the first. The second is the point is the fact that force majeure clause will always have to be looked at holistically, where because the concept is really contract to be read as a whole, correct? So there are 5-6 clauses I would feel that will come into play together. Is one is the time is of essence of or not, right? So that is a typical clause in the contract. The timelines agreed between the parties for various deliverables. Now, if you really see, the IT contracts are pretty complex. There are, some of them would run into, several hundred pages. Not only the contract itself, but the schedules, and each schedule will have a certain deliverable covered in a particular sequence, right? So what are the timelines agreed between the parties? The third point is the interdependency, because often when you have one is a software services, maybe sort of creating the base, but you have to deploy that, implement that, then there is an acceptance process, etc., etc., etc. Before even that, there you have a sort of issues such as specifications to be given, etc., right? So the point I'm trying to make here is there is an interdependency. So the both sides contract, as I can put it simply, as contingent. So unless somebody else performs their part of the service, I am not able to provide my part of the service, right? So that is a third point to be noted. The fourth point, which typically we'll have to look into when you look at a force majeure clause, is the service level agreements, right? What has been agreed between the parties on that. The other point is, of course, the disaster management. And this becomes very, very important in my mind, because when you have large deployments, there always will be a disaster recovery or a disaster management clauses in the contract. The question really arises in this type of a situation, will the force majeure prevail over even the disaster recovery contract or a disaster management clause, or disaster management clause will prevail over the force majeure. So I think that is going to be absolutely important. So that I would request those on the call, if you are sort of attached to the industry, to start revisiting all the customer contracts and identifying what is sort of overpowering which clause. Now coming to the actual play of the clause, right? Now the question arises, so what are the consequences, right, of this force majeure clause or a force majeure event? The question is the force majeure event sort of preventing your sort of compliance? Is it hindering compliance? Is it delaying compliance? Because each of these have to meet a separate threshold, right? And then what is the consequence? Now I will come to whether or not this is a force majeure event, etc. I'm not going to deal with that. I'm going on the assumption that an event is a force majeure event, because otherwise we'll get into too much debate on this, right? What is the consequence? The consequence is whether there is a suspension or there is a termination right, correct? So the question will be that, do I even trigger a force majeure event today, because there are consequences attached to the force majeure clause, right? So I think all these, I will stop here for a bit and to see what Vaibhav has to say on the points that I mentioned. Then maybe we can take one more sort of thought process. But the takeaway for me is, look at the contract as a whole, identify whether the force majeure event has actually been kicked in or not. Do you want to invoke force majeure event today, or do you want to use some other clauses in the contract? For example, you can have an extended period, by mutual agreement, or sort of have an extension that is already built into the contract, etc. Do you first want to exhaust those remedies before you kick in force majeure event, right? So this is these are initial thoughts, and over to you, Vaibhav, and then I will add additional thoughts on how I look at some of the related issues.
Yeah. Thank you, Gowree. Just taking forward what you mentioned, right? My view is that while force majeure is a clause which you can all take benefit of, depending on how you written in the contract, but what Gowree mentioned, right? Trying to see if you can renegotiate with the client at this point in time, or trying to take benefit of any other clause, whether delays or something like that, where you can take benefit. Because triggering force majeure clause can have implications which you have not completely thought through. One, Gowree says that if you put as a suspension, the most force majeure clause has limited time period. So, for example, it can be till it gets over, or 60 days, or some 90 days, or something like that, right? The point is that you don't know. If you trigger something right now, then at the end of the force majeure period, right, will you be in a position to deliver, right? What will be the situation? Or should you wait for some time before and wait till things become little more worse before triggering it? So when to trigger is very, very important. Now, these are the times when you will find clients most accommodating, because there'll be a lot of to and fro to be done. And what I see in the industry when I was talking to people, they also believe that clients are actually quite accommodating, and companies also quite accommodating. So they actually go to and fro in trying to get things resolved, other than using force majeure clause. But if you need to use it, you need to be careful on how you use it. Second is when it comes to the other side. Let's say if I wear a hat of customer, right, and there's a payment to be made, right? Can I say it's a force majeure, so I will not make a payment, right? Is this something which is possible? Generally, payment clauses are excluded in force majeure. So if they're excluded, you will not be able to do it. But if they're not excluded, and if there is a reason, for example, your supply chain things did not work out, and there are certain things which you expected did not happen because of this reason, maybe you can consider force majeure as an option, right, for making payments, right? Now, this again is a very tricky situation. You need to look in your clauses carefully, but see whether this is something which you can do. Secondly, other than payment, most of the clients have certain obligation when it comes to certain things. For example, a lot of software companies activity or responsibilities are contingent on certain responses by clients. And if clients have not responded, or is there a delay in responding, then what will be the implication from that perspective, right? So that is another thing you need to look into. So if the customer does not meet their obligation in the contract, then if software company off the obligation, they don't need to deliver, or what will be the implication on their deliverables, right? That's the other thing you need to look into it. So, and because you are not able to deliver, when I say you, I'm saying customer. If customer is not able to deliver, can they invoke force majeure clause and say, hey, I was supposed to, let's say, I didn't expect acceptance. If I didn't accept a particular deliverable within 7 days, it was a deemed acceptance. But now, because my people are not coming to office, I have no way to look at it. Can I increase this 7 days to 14 days or maybe more? And if I don't, will client be off the liability of delivering that particular product, right? So those kind of questions will come up, and they will need to think through and either renegotiate with the client, trade off certain things where you give a software company a little bit of flexibility and you get some more flexibility, and then do it. And then I think Gowree mentioned time is of essence. A lot of time agreements have mentioned time is of essence, and when time is of essence, if you miss the deadline, there are repercussions. You cannot say, oh, it was just a small thing. But in situations like this, how will it imply? Is the other question you will need to look. Again, as Gowree said, everything will look from holistic perspective. I think from at least the way I look at it, the arbitrators and the courts will be very cognizant of this particular situation. And even though your contract does not have a provision for certain things, they may read saying that, hey, you could not have really performed this contract, and they may be more cognizant on the breach aspect. But with this, Gowree, over to you.
I think Vaibhav, that was my closing line actually, but let me rearticulate the point. So I think a couple of points attached to what you said. In my mind, things like especially for the IT contracts, right? Security will be of the highest priority. So if I'm not able to deliver the service at the security expected, right, then can I take an argument that I was prevented from compliance of my contract, right? So all these aspects will have to be looked into, and if I have not triggered the force majeure clause at a particular time, things which which happened pre my trigger, how will those be dealt with? That will be other situation to be looked into. And of course, cost escalation. Suppose I had to work from home and I had to put certain securities in place, and because of that I had to and plus the disaster management sort of clause has kicked in, and because of that there is an escalation. Is there a clause for price adjustment, right? So all these, ultimately the way I look at it, this particular situation is allocation of responsibilities between the parties and allocation of the commercial impact between the parties, right? And ultimately, considering where we are today, the whole humanity, unfortunately, where we are today, I believe people will adopt a humane approach to these situations, including, if at all there are disputes that arise later. With that, I will I will ask Ajay if he has any concluding remarks on the employment part. And thereafter we'll open, on the, to the floor to the audience if they have any questions.
In fact, there are some questions which has been mentioned by them in the chat window.
Yes, but that's most of them are employment related. Yes.
Yeah. So
you can address.
Sure. So before I give my concluding remarks, I'll quickly pick up a few questions that have been mentioned here. Obviously, I would deal with most of those questions in more detail in our session on Thursday, but maybe let me quickly react to some of these. I think an important one that we are seeing in most of the questions that we are receiving is regarding this particular aspect of reduction of salaries or termination of employment and other aspects. Now, let me quickly get into this. So basically, the Central Labor Ministry has sent an advisory to most of the employers' associations, and it's in the nature of advisory that in these times, which are exceptional, unprecedented times, we should not be going ahead and reducing salaries of employees or maybe terminating employees. So that's in the nature of an advisory, but at the same time, you should be conscious that there are several state governments and district administrations which are simultaneously issuing these lockdown orders. I'll name two of them. One is from Telangana and the other is from Delhi, where it clearly specifically states that during the lockdown period, which in most of the states is until March 31st, 2020, there should not be any reduction in salaries or termination of employment. In fact, the Telangana order goes on to say that if at all somebody is found doing that, then there'll be repercussions under the Epidemic Diseases Act, which again makes a cross-reference to IPC. So I think the repercussions would be high, not just from a legal perspective in some of these states, but at the same time, you also have your reputation at stake, especially in these unprecedented times. And we are right now looking at short term, which is the lockdown order. I can completely understand that from a long-term perspective, considering business may suffer, certain hard decisions may need to be taken at a later stage. But I think at this stage, during the lockdown period, it may not be the most prudent decision to go ahead and reduce salaries or maybe terminate employees.
Thank you. Any other questions? I can see there are certain, questions on the chat about when the lockdown will end, etc. Honestly, this is not something, which is within our knowledge at the moment. All of us obviously hope that it ends soon, but of course, only when all of us are safe enough. But if there are any other questions that the participants want to ask, you may want to unmute your line and ask that question, or put the question in the chat window.
Okay, let me quickly take that. This says, how can IT companies function in Pune? There is complete lockdown and even road closure for private cars. So as of so there have been a couple of orders here. We've been tracking them. We have quite a few clients in Pune in the ITS sector. As of last evening, there has been one order which specifically talks about certain conditions with respect to ITS being considered as essential services, but at the same time, about 20% of the workforce can who are involved in very essential, critical kind of activities in the organization have been allowed to go ahead and work. To answer your question in short, the district administration of Pune has issued those orders. So legally, strictly legally speaking, yes, some of these people are allowed to work in office. But what we should as employers make sure that these are really critical aspects of our work, and we are technically not seen as misusing these kind of orders that have been issued. There are several other essential services which have been kept open, and to that extent, I don't think the police administration or the government administration would unnecessarily harass anybody who is going for handling these critical matters at their offices, including IT,
So
or
I
technology.
believe if the companies are able to issue letters to the employees which they can carry when they travel, will that be helpful for them to sort of answer certain queries by the police, etc.?
Yeah, that may be a good practice that the companies can follow. The order also mentions that from the employers, and I think they can identify people specifically who would be constituting this possibly 20%, up to 20% of this population, which will be handling critical matters. So I think a good suggestion from Gowree that as a good practice, you can have those letters on your letterhead so that you can basically produce those to the government administration whenever they are asked for.
Oh, there is one question for the e-commerce platforms. Do you want to take that?
Yeah, there are 4 new questions coming. I can take the e-commerce one, and then Gowree, if you want to take the service level, you can take the service level, and then we can address the insurance one, right? So I think the question on e-commerce is you see there are orders which allow for e-commerce platform to function, but there are restrictions around warehousing and operation. How does this pan out for e-commerce platforms, right? So 2 things. First, with respect to the restrictions on warehousing and operations, right? It all depends on where the warehouse is situated, what is the local restriction. So you need to look at the restriction at the local district level where the warehouse is. The way we are seeing how our clients handle is first of all where there are less restrictions, you pick up from that particular place rather than from place where there are more restrictions. Similarly, when you look at in terms of delivery, what we are seeing is that some of the clients, at least they have not done right now in India, but globally the way they are looking at it, they are prioritizing certain essential deliveries and non-prioritizing the non-essential products, right? So for example, there are certain products which are very important from delivery perspective, from servicing perspective. They are pushing that as a priority, and some products which are not that critical, they are delaying the delivery services, such that the workload on the courier service or the delivery service reduces, right? That's the way they are handling it. I think in India also, this is how most likely the e-commerce company will respond. They will streamline their operations and products in a manner where they focus on critical and important deliveries first, and the others later as and when the kind of restrictions get reduced. So that's the way I'm looking at it, things panning out. Gowree, you want to take the other one?
Yeah, sure. So in fact, we are having a separate session on drone delivery, and probably that's something will be very interesting to see these times, whether now Indian government should be revisiting some of the drone related laws that we have.
I'll take a two quick questions that I can see on the screen. The last one really sort of made me think quite a bit in last 2 minutes, which is a very, very interesting question, that whether when you say essential services, do they mean only within India or abroad as well? Because yes, we do have several BPOs that support, healthcare services abroad. And, at these times, I think this is a very, very important to see whether we are treating only support in India as essential or across the world as essential, right? I don't have a ready answer here. Maybe Ajay, if there is a clarity out there in any circular, but I would really urge the Indian government, if at all this is not clarified, to have a humanitarian ground. And our prime minister's call, to the entire G20 and the the SAARC countries, etc., where we want to show a kind of solidarity. I think this will be one important aspect to show that as well. But Ajay, is there a clarity on this?
I think we'll have to check the law on that front, as in as you said, it's a very novel question. So we'll need to check exactly what essential services mean. My initial reaction would be possibly only essential services in India, but I think we'll need to recheck that.
Okay, so we have some time to. I'll take additional question. There was a question on the service level due to the reduction of workforce. So you're absolutely right. Now we need to see the contract the way it is drafted. For example, if there is a scope for change request, as we see that when you have a SOW, this, the work order that has been issued between the parties, if that provides or that requires a certain SLA, and there is an ability for change request with a certain, of course, cost impact. If at all there is such provision, it would be also advisable to see whether you want to invoke that provision rather than directly, invoking a force majeure provision. So of course it will depend on a case-to-case basis, but as I said, this will be a time of renegotiation of several contracts, and just as a good practice, there is a possibility that there is a possibility that due to the times that we are facing, things may happen over the email, quickly, but it may be a good practice to record it as is contemplated under the contract and try to do the documentation at least as a follow-up action to close the loop. So I hope that answers the question by Mr. Ambar Gupta.
Hi, Ajay.
Yes. Hi. I can.
Hi, this is Karan from KPMG. So we have a question which I put it on the chat also.
Yeah.
So what if an employer has rolled out an offer to an employee and eventually for the lockdown reason has to back out for the offer? So is the employer liable to pay salary for that?
So it will basically depend on whether the offer has been accepted by the employee when this particular employee when this was backed out. So if it has been accepted, if the offer has been accepted, technically, legally speaking, it has become a contract. So to that extent, as in reneging from the contract will be as difficult for you to that extent. And especially in these exceptional circumstances where COVID cannot be the only reason for basically reneging a contract as such. So I think to answer your question in short, if it has been accepted, it becomes a contract for you, and to that extent, you cannot renege from it. Obviously, a practical way would be to talk through with the person if there is no possibility of continuing the employment, and possibly settle the matter if you can.
Okay, thank you.
There
Yeah,
are several.
just one other clarification, as in before, as in so we'll take quite a few of these questions in our session on Thursday, as I said, on at 9 p.m. But just to clarify, there is this question which says you mentioned Telangana and Delhi have issued orders to prohibit termination. So just to clarify there, the Delhi and Telangana orders right now talk about only not reducing salaries and paying in full. There is no mention of termination as such, and these orders are applicable during the lockdown period, which is until usually March 31st, 2020. But again, as I said, not the best given the situations and the unprecedented circumstances. Not the best time to initiate termination in your organization, at least for the next 10 to 12 days.
Okay, thank you.
Ajay. Is there any other question? And if there are any employment related questions, as I said, which may require some more time of discussion, we have not addressed those right now, but rest assured it will be addressed on Thursday. But if there are any other further questions, the participant may want to unmute and ask that question. We have about 4 minutes left, so maybe a couple of questions we can quickly address.
Gowree, hi, Nimith here. So, is there any impact to the insurance policies that is taken either by the company or as an individual, given that the Epidemic Act is now invoked? Any clarity on that?
So it will typically depend upon the way the insurance policy is drafted. And Vaibhav had earlier, spoken briefly. So maybe Vaibhav, you want to quickly take that question? I think Vaibhav, we are not able to hear him. But I think Nimit, the way will be, we'll have to see how the insurance policies have been drafted and what are the exclusions. And that's exactly what Vaibhav was mentioning earlier. One is to see the existing policies, but I guess insurance companies will start revisiting and contemplating these type of situations. And the other interesting thing will be that, so COVID is the first sort of cause, right? But arising out of COVID, there are there are consequential causes for certain thing to happen. So how do you look at that on a step-by-step basis, and whether or not insurance covers that or insurance excludes that, right? So that consequential thing also will have to be taken into account, in this particular, while interpretation of the insurance policy.
Just to add to what Gowree said, right? Actually, the question really was with respect to whether Epidemic Act, which has been invoked, does it have anything in insurance? I have not seen the insurance aspect, and maybe we can relook at the Epidemic Act, but I don't think currently I have come across anything which affects the insurance aspect.
We would, yes, Gowree, Vaibhav and Ajay, thank you all for the session today, and thank you to all our participants. It's been really nice to have all of you. And as just a reminder that a series of webinars are lined up, and the schedule would be in your inbox. So you're most welcome to join in to all the sessions that we've planned in this week. Thank you so much.